Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our King's Expert series, which is all about climate change and sustainability. We're so pleased that you've been able to join us this evening, and I'd also like to welcome our international audience as well that are joining us online. We've got a wonderful panel lined up for you this evening, and in the second half of this event, the in-person audience will have their opportunity to put questions to the panel. And then after the event, we'd like to welcome you to join our reception in the Arcade Cafe. So myself and my colleagues will guide you there as well if you'd like to join us, and our speakers will be there as well if you have any further questions for them. So that's all I have to say for now. So please do join me in welcoming our speakers to the stage.
Great. Good evening. I hope you can hear me. Yeah. My name is Frans Berkhout. I'm a professor in the Department of Geography here. I've done work on climate change, mainly climate change impacts and adaptation for about 25 years, actually. And twice I was a lead author in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Right now, I lead a large college initiative called King's Climate and Sustainability, which is seeking to embed climate and sustainability into everything we do. So embed it into curricula, grow the research we do, become ourselves a net zero organization in the long term, and thinking very carefully about our resource use and so on. And also trying, and I think tonight is an example of that, to position King's as a place that convenes important discussions about issues to do with sustainability. I think the way we characterize our unique niche in a very crowded market, because of course many universities globally, but also in this country, do work in this area, is that we see ourselves not as advocates of the problem. So we're not a climate modeling institute. We're really advocates about solutions. So we're interested in the process of transition towards sustainability. The many technological, political, economic, cultural issues that we face now as we try to transform our societies into societies which are going to be more sustainable. How do we decarbonize our energy systems? How do we decarbonize our built environment? We use an awful lot of gas at King's, and many of you will at home as well. How do we transform the built environment, transport systems, and so on? And that is really where we're looking, technologically, in engineering, in the political economy of these kinds of changes. What do voters want to vote for? Economically, how do you develop policies that incentivize the right kind of behavior, and so on, without bankrupting everyone or annoying them, as these things make things more difficult, perhaps travel, are we going to be able in the future to travel quite in the way we did now? So all these kinds of questions, I think, are the vital questions of the moment. And that's, I think, where, as King's coming together, we'd like to position ourselves. So I hope some of that will come through in the discussion. I'd like to introduce, first of all, Catherine Tilley. Catherine, maybe you could just introduce yourself and say who you are.
Yes, hello everyone. I am Catherine Tilley. I'm a senior lecturer actually here at the business school. It's really nice to see an audience that isn't tired undergraduates in this room. And I'm also a thing called an impact director at our Centre for Sustainable Business. And the Centre for Sustainable Business is our research hub focused on the problems of trying to make business socially and environmentally sustainable. And we have an impact director because we think it's really important to spend a lot of time actually solving problems with businesses rather than simply discussing the theory of it all. And so I spend a lot of my time, when I'm not in this building, out in the company of organizations trying to understand and work on their most material problems.
Great. Could you say something quickly about some of the key themes in the centre?
I absolutely could. I could say it at some length, but I'll try and keep it quick. So we work on 4 problems, and they're kind of interrelated. It's really easy to sort of disaggregate them, but fundamentally, Those of you who have a background in economics will have heard of a thing called demand and supply. So we work on problems of sustainable consumption. How do we buy stuff or use stuff in a way that is responsible? The sort of corollary of that is we also work on the problems of supply. So how do we think about, in a world where supply chains are incredibly complex, ensuring the social and environmental impacts that happen upstream of the shop are being managed responsibly and managed effectively? And then we look at two things that kind of underpin how organizations work. We look at money, and in particular, how money flows towards more or less socially and environmentally sustainable projects. And with that, actually problems of data. How do we know which ones are the more sustainable projects? And we look at people and what it means to lead in an environment that is particularly complex and particularly challenging.
Great. Thank you very much. George Adamson, please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Frans. I'm George Adamson. I'm what's called a reader in climate and society, which suggests that I don't do any teaching, which is not true. It's part of the kind of slightly archaic promotion system that we have in the academy. I work in the same department as Frans, which is the Department of Geography. And my own research is a kind of interdisciplinarity looking at how different forms of knowledge interact, which I'm sure I'll talk about later. I also nominally lead a group called the King's Climate Research Hub, which I suppose is the counterpart to the Centre for Sustainable Business, but in the Faculty of Social Science and Public Policy. And we're a loose collection of researchers. We have a number of remits. Our research remit is to examine climate change as an issue which sits at the interface of science and society. So although we are a collection of social scientists, we have quite an interest in the role that science plays, both in solving climate change, also the problems that science creates, and the way that climate science and other forms of knowledge, particularly scientific knowledge, change the way that we understand the world.
Great. So the format of the event today is that the three of us will have a conversation until about 7:10. So for about half an hour. And I hope to just dig down a little bit into the research that Catherine and colleagues and George and colleagues are doing here at King's, and why that matters and why that might be interesting to you. And then after that, there'll be an opportunity for members of the audience who are here, physically present, to ask questions or make points yourself. And we'll seek to respond to those. So as things become interesting for you, then please do store those up, and at about 7:10, in about half an hour, I'll open out for questions. Is that okay? Yeah? Does that work? Great. Okay. Thanks. So, Catherine, sustainable consumption, which is one of the things you started with. I wonder whether you could just unpack some of that. What are the kinds of issues a consumer of an everyday product or service is confronted with when they're seeking to make a more or less environmental, ethical choice?
It's a great question. So we've all been in supermarkets, right? There's typically about 70,000 different stock keeping units, and you want to get through and you want to get out. And there's all this stuff, and some of it is in green packaging that's supposed to suggest something, and some of it is got labels on it. It's, it's got some sort of accreditation because the fish, I don't know, were from a particular fishery or whatever it was. And it's incredibly difficult. And if you go and survey people, lots of people have done this survey. Typically, we always get the same result, which is when you ask consumers, would you pay extra for an environmentally friendly product? 40% of you will say yes. I mean, looking at you, I don't know which 40%, but typically that's the response that we get. We get it. All sorts of people have done that. And then when you go and follow people around supermarkets and look at what they actually do, it's different from what they said when they were surveyed. And so we're really trying to understand, well, what is driving that difference? What is going on with people's behavior? And I mean, there's a number of things about shopping behavior that are difficult. Some of it is about the information that's available. Some of it is about store selection. you know, if you go and talk to the chief sustainability officers of supermarkets, they'll say, yeah, we know that we want to increase the store presence of our vegan range, but down the corridor, there's someone who is a meat buyer and is doing really well, and we're not sure how to manage those trade-offs. So you do get these difficult problems where the retailer is making one set of choices and giving one set of information. They're storing brands that are providing another set of information, and it's a bit overwhelming for most of us when we're shopping. So what do we do about it? I think it's an area which actually challenges us as individuals to think about our own consumption. Now, obviously, I go to lots of meetings. It's the suit. And people say to me, oh, yes, you're this. Those of you who've been to meetings in the UK, you know, there's a little bit of chat at the beginning when everyone goes, how did you get here? First of all, that doesn't happen in other countries. It seems to be a very UK thing. Oh, the A303 was blocked up again. So I show up and they say, how did you get here? And I came on the tube. And there's often an assumption that I came in an electric vehicle because I work in sustainability. Mm. And we have the chat about cars. And I said, well, actually, I don't have a car. And there's, depending on the meeting that you're in, various degrees of horror about that. But actually, you know, my big act of sustainable consumption is not buying, or it's specifically not buying a car. Cars are idle for about 96% of the time. There's about 30,000 components in a car. They're made of a very wide variety of quite difficult materials. So, you know, we need to think more broadly about what our repertoire of choices is and include not buying as one of them. Now, in the Centre for Sustainable Business, obviously, we're really interested in consumer behaviour and how that is shaped and influenced. And a lot of it does then come back to companies and what is it that we put out there, both in terms of product and the role that we can play in sort of choice editing. So none of the major supermarkets has yet delisted meat, but the degree of prominence that they give to meat-free items is very variable. And that is driving certain patterns of human behavior. So there's some things we can do as businesses about just what we put out there and how we label it. And then there's more we can do about consumer education. And again, if you go and look in a clothing store, all of the information is either on a label that is kind of hidden deep inside a garment, or it's on a hang tag. And it's typically very hard to understand. And you know, if you look at something like 30% recycled polyester, is that good or is that bad? We don't really have a sort of calibration mechanism for that. And by the way, the answer to is that good or bad also depends on what the feedstock for the polyester was. So, you know, it's not even like the company can give you a straight answer. So I think one of the big challenges here is it's immensely complicated for consumers, and that gets in the way. They get overwhelmed. And so it becomes a problem for businesses of, well, how do you make it clear? How do you help people make better informed choices? And what's your responsibility towards them as consumers? I don't think we've figured that out yet.
Can you just unpack a little bit what the responsibility of the retailer or the producer is there? So, I mean, one argument might be that, I mean, consumers are, you know, they're going to be, you know, time pressed. Perhaps, you know, they've got budgets. You know, they may not be paying particular attention to this, but as a retailer, I want to make it easier for people to make the right choices. And maybe there are things I should be doing just in the background in the way I source my cotton if I'm Marks and Spencer's or something like that. What's the responsibility for business to lead in a sense, the choices that are made available? They do that all the time anyway, but they're also deeply responsive to what the consumer is buying and picking up and so on. So how do you get that balance right as a business?
I do think that enlightened businesses have to show leadership on this. Organic cotton is a really good example. You can't tell the difference whether your cotton is organic or not. There's no particular difference in hand feel. But if you have organic cotton or in conversion cotton, which is cotton which is being farmed by farmers who are working towards organic certification, it means that it is having a direct effect on the landscapes in which those farmers are operating. So organic cotton is a good thing. It's at a slightly higher price point as a raw material than unorganic cotton. but it is, it's a really interesting example of a case where I think enlightened retailers or enlightened brands can decide that they want to do this better and can think about what their role is in driving conversion to organic. So some of it is about, certified organic, but some of it is about increasing the amount of in-conversion cotton that is being grown and looking at where it is being grown. The other thing about organically certified cotton is you have to look at what the labour conditions were too, because labour conditions on farms are sometimes problematic. But I do think sometimes you just have to be brave and make a choice to do that. One of the things that we're seeing in cotton at the moment is I have concerns about the traceability of cotton, which is that you want to know that that cotton actually came from the farm that said it was going to be organic. And it goes through several processes between being grown and me wearing it. Several processes after that as well, actually, in terms of recycling and things. And so the traceability of cotton is something that we are going to see a lot more pressure on in coming years. I do think regulators have a role here as well. I think the European Union has been particularly enlightened in trying to bring in much more clarity about what's expected from supply chains. But there is a lot of work to be done.
There's a lot of pushback from business on these new EU regulations, aren't there, about supply chains, traceability and so on, particularly at a time of economic difficulty, cost of living crisis and so on.
Yeah.
Perhaps companies that 5 years ago felt there was brand value in being enlightened have retrenched because they see that, consumers' spending habits have changed and perhaps there's been a bit of a retreat there. What do you say about that? There's this idea that you mentioned as well, that often the sustainable choice is just a little bit more expensive than the or the less sustainable choice.
With cotton it is. With things like recycled polyester, it's more or less at the same price point at the moment. But with any commodity, you've got fluctuations anyway. And with agricultural products, there are parts of the world where it's getting a bit hotter and a bit harder to grow things. So I do think, we will continue to see some volatility. I think we're seeing a lot of, if we think of something like textiles, but this is also true in foods. So the sort of commodities that we all buy quite a lot, we're seeing a lot of innovation in terms of new materials coming in. And so, will that start to substitute things at a different price point? Possibly, yes. But yeah, I think retailers in particular are very conscious that there is a cost of living crisis going on at the moment. And they are trying to find smart ways to offer products that can be good and accessible. And some of this is about design decisions as well. How much, if we're talking about clothes, we seem to be talking about clothes, but if we're talking about clothes, how much fabric do you use? I was looking at baby grows the other day, and there was this adorable baby grow with a breast pocket. Now, those of you who know babies will know that they don't use pockets, and if they did, it wouldn't be good. It would all be very sticky. And that's a piece of material. It's tiny piece of material, but it's a lot of tiny pieces of material. And it's actually a lot of manufacturing skill that goes into putting those on, because products are still made by people with their hands. And if you'd simply designed that out, it could have been slightly cheaper, slightly less material, slightly less stuff that could go wrong in manufacture. So there are things like that are tiny looking decisions that actually have implications.
And then my final question before we move on to George is to do with greenwashing.
Oh, yes.
So, this is very current in many contemporary debates about business, consumers, claims, and so on. Almost any label, the MSC you mentioned earlier, has been attacked in all sorts of ways by NGOs, claiming that what they're doing is greenwashing or biowashing or whatever you want to call it. Very hard, actually, on both sides to get it right. So, what should we be thinking about that? What does latest research tell us about that sort of thing as a business challenge?
As a business challenge, it is a really interesting business challenge. So one of the things that I do when I'm teaching sustainability and ethics is I give the students a bit of homework where they have to write a memo written from the point of view of someone in an organization, calling out a problem that they see as ethical or sustainability problem. And very often we get problems of greenwashing. Very often they say, you know, look, you've said this and you're doing that, and that's really bad. And it feels as though we have a very strong reaction to things that feel like hypocrisy. And I think that's quite hardwired in us. And that's a good thing. It's good to have that reaction. But it puts a problem back on companies, which is, on the one hand, you want to be transparent and you want to say, this is where our cotton comes from and this is where our fish comes from and so on. But on the other hand, you are very frightened of the gotcha question. Now, if you imagine a sort of spectrum from companies that have been doing quite bad things and have been sort of obfuscating in their reporting to try and hide what they're doing, that has definitely gone on in some sectors and continues to go on in some sectors. And at the other end, you've got sort of total transparency, and they both attract some negative attention for different reasons. And so I think, you know, you will never, as a business person, there's never a right way to handle this. It's always going to be problematic. We've got two bits of incoming regulation in the European Union that are designed to try and address this to a certain extent. The first one is CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which tells you what you can and can't put in an annual report. Now, those of you who've ever read the Coca-Cola annual report and accounts, now that you're over your insomnia, we can talk about, there's a whole load about money, but then there's a
That's what you do for a living, is that?
I think, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
It has to be one, doesn't it?
It's great here at the business school. No, it is great here at the business school. So, you know, so there's a whole lot about money. Then there's a section about their sustainability report. And reading it, you would not know that they were the world's biggest plastic polluter. You'd see a lot about, you know, nice initiatives they're taking with water in Africa. You'd see that they're working on plastics, but you can't really tell from that report just how good or bad they are. And so the European Union has come up with a new disclosure directive that is much clearer about what you can say, what you can't say, and how you should say it, so that we've got more of a sort of transparent and fair basis of comparison between companies. I think that will put a lot of pressure on companies, but certainly from a sort of a corporate, from a statutory responsibility point of view, I think it will be helpful. As an accountant, you're supposed to sign off the reports as a true and fair view. And this is an attempt to get a true and fair view of what they're doing ecologically and socially. Second piece of legislation is the Green Claims Directive, which says that if you make a green claim, so the shirt is organic, it needs to be supported by scientific evidence. And that makes it much harder to make brand claims. It makes it much harder to say, we're a nice company, trust us. You actually have to be able to say, this product is good for these reasons. And here's the evidence that supports that. And I think that puts a lot more pressure on companies in terms of the sorts of disclosure that they are able to make. What we're seeing in some quarters is a bit less communication as a result, because it's actually got harder. And I think people are very nervous, particularly about the idea of sort of gotcha journalists. But it is really changing the direction for companies that work in Europe or trade with the European Union in terms of what they're now starting to say and why.
Paradoxes. You see very interesting paradoxes. You try and be more transparent, but actually, the risk of doing it, that's right.
Exactly.
Not always easy. Really good. George, I want to turn to you. Just now, you're telling me you've just been to Ladakh. And just explain to the audience what on earth you're doing in Ladakh. Maybe you could explain where Ladakh is.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, I'll take a step back from there because I realized the word culture is written on this piece of paper next to my name. So why is someone who works in a geography department interested in culture? Well, I've been several things over my career. Usually at the same time, I've been a climate scientist. I've kind of been a historian of science. I've looked at climate change adaptation in the past and in the present, risk management. And ultimately, what I realized is that you can't really solve climate change using the narrow disciplines that we have in academia, partly because those disciplines emerged for all kinds of historical, colonial, sometimes pure chance reasons, particularly geography, the discipline that I come from. I don't know whether it's good to segue from that to me kind of trudging around the Himalayas, but what I essentially came to the realization was that climate change is embedded in culture. And that's kind of done in three ways, I'd say. Now, one relates to what Catherine was talking about, which is that all of these decisions about how we mitigate, how we adapt, how we change, how we transform, they're all informed by culture. I mean, look, go back to what you're saying about the meetings and the fact that we start meetings in this country by talking about, you know, you came on the train or you cycled here. My word, really, to a meeting? You know, that's cultural. And of course, that's different in every single country, although there's only one climate. Arguably, I can come to that. It's cultural in the sense that there are other ways of thinking in the world. I know we think that we have it all covered here in King's, but of course that's not true at all. And I've been increasingly thinking about cultural practice, I mean the arts, if you want to call it that, whatever they may be, and the different ways of thinking that come from thinking, expressing ourselves in ways that are different to the very linear ways that we tend to think in universities, whether that's scientists or social scientists or the humanities. We tend to think in quite linear ways. And then the third one is that the very way that we understand what climate is and the way that it changes is informed by culture. You think of culture as the kind of stories that we tell ourselves to make sense of a chaotic world. Well, that's basically what we're doing with climate. Climate models will tell us this is what climate is, and science will tell us this is what climate is. But if we step back and we think about how do we actually engage with weather and climate in our everyday lives, it will be nice weather today, isn't it? Oh, it's very rainy for the time of year. Now, we could go back and we can look at the data and say, is it really rainy for the time of year? Is it really warm or cold for the time of year? But that is part of our kind of way of living. And it's related to our sense of place and, you know, our community and the conventions that we have in this country and in this city, et cetera, et cetera. So this is all culture. And I'm kind of thinking about those different ways of approaching culture through different projects that I'm working in. So that brings to Ladakh. So for those who don't know, Ladakh is about as far north as you can get in India. So it's a border region. Very interesting part of India because it borders China, it borders Pakistan. When you're in India and you look at Google Maps, it's very, very confusing for the first few days because there are borders, which if you look in the UK, are not there when you're looking at Google Maps in India. There are huge parts of the world that are administered by Pakistan and China, which are recognized as being administered by Pakistan and China, although they're recognized as contested, which if you look at Google Maps in India, are just shown as part of India. So you don't quite know where to go. If you're walking a bit too far, you've got a problem. But I was there looking at artificial glaciers. So this is something there's a kind of traditional way of storing water. So Ladakh is about 2.5 to 6,000 plus meters, depending on where you are. And Leh, which is the capital, is about 3,500 meters. The second city, Kargil, is about 2.5 to 3,000 meters. I mean, it's mountainous. It's very, very cold. Even now, the winter is shrinking. But it's still, you know, it regularly gets down to -20, -30. It's totally cut off. And what happens in the winter and the spring is you don't get a lot of access to water. So there's quite an old technique of blocking off the rivers to try and in the winter, and then that will freeze, or the snowfall will come down, that will freeze, and you can melt it in the summer. And there are now more. It's quite simple engineering, but there's more sophisticated ways of building these artificial glaciers. One that the guys I've been working with in India, you basically run a pipe down from a spring or even from the meltwater of the glaciers themselves. And that pipe just brings water down. You usually bury it so that it doesn't actually freeze in winter. And then at nighttime, as soon as the temperature drops below freezing, you open up the pipe and then you have a little spray nozzle. It sprays the water out, freezes in the air, usually, if the temperature is cold enough, falls down, and it creates these tall kind of ice structures. And they call them ice stupors over there. And the reason they call them ice stupors is because this is a Buddhist part of the world. And this is supposed to be that it's very much within the kind of local culture because they're stupors. Now, the extent to which that is true, or whether it's kind of a PR exercise for those building these things, is debatable, as is the extent to which it really is a climate change adaptation. So I've been going out there as part of a small seed funding project with some colleagues from King's to try to understand what are these things, where are they being deployed, why are they being deployed, to what extent are they actually solving any problems? Because what happens is they're bringing water to one area, which is then released during the springtime, I suppose what we would call springtime over here, so April, May, June, which is when you really need water to plant your crops. And then the glacial meltwater comes down in July. So to an extent, they're not really climate change adaptations, because what they're doing is actually bringing water during a period where you wouldn't historically have had a lot of water, and they don't prevent the glaciers from melting, to put it simply. So lots and lots of questions up there, and they're all embedded within the culture of the region up there and where they use water.
George, I think the insight, and certainly why we funded the thing, was that, you know, here was a rather unique traditional technology that dealt with the problem of the water balance in mountainous regions, a great problem. The great rivers in South Asia are in trouble because the glaciers are melting, and the flow, particularly the important flows in the spring and summer when they're really needed for irrigation in the valleys, feeding billions of people actually. Those are really going to be under stress, certainly by the end of this century. And the question is whether this kind of traditional type of production of glaciers is one way in which you could slightly mitigate those things, not just in the Himalayas, but maybe in other mountainous regions as well. So that was the sort of the kernel of an idea, which was very attractive to us when we funded this project.
Yeah, and the answer, as is often the case with academics, our answer is we need to do more research to every single question. I noticed you did it as well, Catherine.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the culture.
But possibly.
Right.
Possibly. Plenty of people think that it's very, very helpful having these things here. And I can see they can be incredibly beneficial. You know, they bring the water which is dispersed, is frozen to a particular area, and which is then released to a particular place that can be used to plant crops. It is a desert region, by the way, Ladakh. It's not further south in the Himalayas, you get the monsoon, and I mean, Everest itself is bombarded by precipitation during the monsoon. But this is a little bit further north than that region. So the Indian monsoon doesn't hit. So it doesn't really, you don't really get precipitation during the monsoon period. Precipitation is all during kind of winter and spring. Can they replace the water that's coming from the glaciers? Maybe. Certainly at the moment, they can bring water to areas that don't have them. They can provide water at a time that it's not usually there, because the glaciers don't melt till later. They may be replacing water from the glaciers at the moment. That's something that's unclear. Because the glaciers right now, the meltwater comes down in July. It's quite possible that they might have come down earlier when the glaciers were larger, which of course they're not anymore. It could also be quite maladaptive in the sense that the glaciers will continue to retreat. And what you don't want to end up is a situation where more and more villages have installed these things, and they found, great, they're getting water in May, June, they can plant their crops, but they're still reliant on the water from the glacier. And then eventually that will stop. Of course, as well, there are certain locations that it's really useful to have them. I mean, I was there in April, and some of the ones we saw were totally still frozen. In fact, one was absolutely covered in snow because they used it to protect against avalanches, as well as to provide water. And one we saw was about 50% melted already because it was too low and there's too much sunlight hitting it. And then, of course, there's the question of the future. You're still reliant on cold temperatures, although there may be other technologies you can use to kind of artificially reduce the temperatures. And of course, those temperatures will change in the future, and the season where you're getting cold enough temperatures will start to decrease.
George, just before, and we've got about 5 minutes, so I hope you're storing up some questions, to switch to something completely different that you do, which is about surveying public opinion in this country in relation to climate change and, you know, cultural receptions of weather and how people talk about that. Could you just talk about some of the work you've done in relation to that and what insights you've sort of gleaned from that work in a very different kind of context?
Yeah, so there's a couple of projects that I've been working on there. One is, I don't know if I'd call it a survey of public perceptions. I mean, we deliberately didn't mention climate change when we spoke to people. We would do essentially oral histories and sit down with someone. We focused on the east of England, kind of East Anglia, and usually older people, and would just say, tell us some stories about weather that you remember. And people would always say, I have nothing to say, you know. And then suddenly you'd say, right, we've been talking for 2.5 hours now, you know, we should probably stop. And they say, really? Have we? And what we're trying to build there is a picture of the way that people understand the kind of boundaries of normality in weather. So I talked earlier about people would say, oh, it's people are complaining that it's so cool at the moment in late May. It's not at all. I mean, it's been wetter this year. I'm not even sure that's entirely true from May, not like it was in the winter. But in terms of temperatures, this is quite normal. In fact, it's above normal. So it's above normal for the 30-year average. It's certainly above normal for the 20th century. So how do people build up those pictures in their minds aside from what they might read in the newspaper? Although people do come to that without you bringing them to it. They'll discuss the present or the past in the context of the present. Aside from science, although again, some people will come to that, some people won't. I guess some preliminary findings, people kind of anchor their memories on certain key events. So people will come back to the winter of 62, 63, the summer of 1976, the storm of 1987, 2003 summer tends to get a mention. And these kind of form slightly mythical the memories take on a kind of slightly mythical form where they're not necessarily related to actually what the temperatures were like. They just become kind of anchor points, I suppose. Yeah. We haven't done enough analysis of those data to really come at you with any kind of firm conclusions. Although I would say that people almost have two realities, I think, when you talk to them about their weather. They will both be able to tell you, I think it snowed a lot more in the past. You know, I remember it snowing like back in the 50s and the 60s nearly every single year. You know, they'll say, I don't know if it's true or not, but that's certainly what I remember. And at the same time, we'll tell you that climate change is kind of not quite a con, although some people did say that, but certainly it's not as big a deal as people say. And whilst also saying it doesn't really snow anymore. So I think if you can find a way to bridge those kind of two realities, it's almost like once you start thinking about climate change, people have a very different way of, they put a lens on the present, which is slightly different to their own experience.
Yeah. Very interesting. Any questions from the audience? Have you been triggered by any of you've heard so far? Yes, a couple of questions here. Great. This is what we'd hoped for. So the lady, Jessica.
Lady in the second row.
Lady in the second row is the first one here.
Hi, I'm Sachi. I'm studying ESG management.
Can everyone hear this? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So my question is about how you're talking about how it's becoming an increasingly normal culture to accept even, say, maybe the extreme weather events that are happening where it's more dependent on people's memories and experiences, and they're sort of starting to kind of deny that climate change is even a reality or it's really going to impact them. And I just wanted to understand that, in your opinion, how effective would it be in terms of the upcoming regulations that are coming on, in terms of really changing the mindset? Because I believe that once the government comes in and says that, okay, this is wrong, that's when people's mindset can really start changing and the culture can start changing. An extreme example, of course, is America, where they seem to be going backwards, where the laws seem to be now completely denying climate change. Like in Florida, for example, where they said that they're going to remove the term climate change from the current laws. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So this contrast between a sort of internal individual discourse or history that people might have constructed, the type you're talking about, and a public discourse which may be influenced partly by scientific pronouncements and partly by Ron DeSantis, banning the mention of climate change. I read that as well this week in curricula and so on, because it's, yes. Well, how do you think that is being made sense of by the ordinary member of the public?
It's an interesting one. I mean, America, fortunately, the USA is a bit of an outlier in the sense it has this strong polarization. To an extent, you get that polarization on the kind of left democratic side as well, where I think people will go to climate change in their heads too easily. And there's certainly a huge objection of it in the right. So I think it's very important to be aware of what's happening in America without assuming that that's necessarily going to happen everywhere else, or at least that's what I keep telling myself. I think that, I mean, there's kind of two, there's lots of things that you brought up there, and I'll offer two kind of responses. One is that I don't think you need to transition. I don't think you need strong kind of belief in climate change to transition. Yeah. In the sense that the US, well, I saw it was Hillary Clinton had tweeted some kind of modeling study of what will happen to US emissions under a Trump administration or under a second Biden administration. And under a second Biden administration, CO2 would kind of do this. What it needs to do is like that. And under the Trump administration, it would kind of do this. So it's still dropping, just not dropping enough. Now, Biden has clearly made climate change quite central to at least his kind of rhetoric. And yet the gulf in what's needed between what he's trying to do and what's needed, the difference there is far bigger than the difference between what you get with Biden and what you would get with Trump. And you still get a decrease with Trump. So that's kind of I find that slightly optimistic and slightly depressing in the sense that I think that you can still transition away from fossil fuels in the sense of huge rejection of climate change. In the sense you can use other mechanisms.
Yeah.
The other way of thinking of that is I think that you can, what I would like to do anyway, when I get to that point in my research, is you can use these narratives of change and kind of sense of place and memory and kind of older people talking about snowy winters that didn't happen as a way to actually encourage people to address climate change. That's what I would like to go in 3-4 years, is to start to think about climate change as in terms of sense of place and protecting sense of place and conserving sense of place. Which is not necessarily right or left in terms of the politics. It's kind of transcends, I suppose.
Catherine, do you want to say something to this?
So 2 comments about the business narrative in America. First of all, I agree. It's weird that science has become so politicized. I don't get that, but it's not my culture. Not me to judge. I do, however, talk to quite a lot of chief sustainability officers that have work involved in America, and it is about the language that they use. So they're really, really careful. They never talk about ESG. They talk about our growth agenda, which happens to be low carbon. And there are some things that you can do. So basically, when you're doing a lot of sustainable things, you are normally using less resources, which, surprise, surprise, means it's less expensive in some ways. So I was talking to the chief sustainability officer of a hotel chain, and she has some hotels in Florida. And apparently one of their clients had said, what are these woke things on the roof? And she said, cheap electricity. Solar panels, right? Yeah, there's nothing woke about a solar panel. It is cheaper electricity if you happen to live in the place that's actually called the Sunshine State. And so, they find that talking about a very kind of utilitarian business case is the way to get things done.
Texas has seen by far the largest growth of renewable growth in the last 5 years.
True.
Yeah.
It is actually the renewable boom state, while at the same time, of course, a place where a lot of people would disavow climate change. So I think these kinds of contrasts are going to be part of the reality of the politics and the industrial and technological realities that we're going through in this energy transition. There was a question here, I think.
Hi, I'm Roger. I'm a chemistry graduate from King's College a few years ago now. When I'm consulting with organisations, I always like to go back to root cause analysis and then try and work up from there. And there's an elephant in the room that we haven't really discussed here yet, it seems. I'm interested in the panel's view. And that is the explosion in the human population around the world is really the underlying cause of all of this. Less people would mean less demand on resources, less carbon dioxide emissions and so forth, because we'd all have less people needing things. In Western Europe, we've done our bit. The population is now diminishing in terms of the natives here. I think for every 2 people, we're having something like 1.8 children now. So we've done our bit. Already in Western Europe, it's where the population is exploding, perhaps in India, certainly elsewhere. If we don't do something about that, we're going to approach what the mathematicians call a catastrophe in catastrophe theory, where the population will get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then we will tip over the edge, perhaps due to some natural phenomena, and there will be a shortage, global shortage. Everyone will start fighting. We'll have World War III, and that will certainly solve the population explosion problem, because but also won't do the environment any good. So I'm interested in the panel's view about how we tackle the root cause problem. Everything else we're doing is great. It helps a lot to make us able to sustain more people and develop more things in a sustainable way. We can't keep growing the population, because no matter all these efforts, if we go bigger, 8 billion, 9 billion, 10 billion, 20 billion, 30 billion people, where do we stop? And how do we bring about a peaceful stop to that population growth and reach a stable situation?
Malthus. Anyone want to talk about Malthus?
Malthus.
Yeah.
George, you want to start on this? This is such a fascinating.
I mean, I kind of agree partially, but not entirely with what you're saying. I mean, the reason that I'm skeptical of that is because I did start as a kind of historical geographer, and there's been various times in the past couple of 100 years where people have said we are reaching an unsustainable level of population, and they've all been false. Yes, wars over resources do happen and will happen. I'm personally doubtful that we will get some kind of big crash. However, that's partly because I don't think we're going to hit 20, 30, 40 billion. I mean, birth rates do generally decrease when countries become more developed. I mean, you look at China now, I've seen population projections to the end of the century for China, which have China dropping to 150 million. I mean, it's the most optimistic, the kind of highest uncertainty has it at about 500 million. So China is already kind of turned over. India will go the same way as the middle class increases. The big population growth is going to be in Africa. Is that good or bad? I would never turn around and say that fewer people is the answer to a problem. But then again, I think that the population will start it will level over and then drop over certainly my daughter's lifespan, maybe not mine.
So I'm not a demographer. I've read some things by demographers, but this isn't my specialist expertise. But 2 things. One is, where is population growth coming from? It's coming from people not dying before they're 5. It's coming from improved survival in childhood. And I cannot condemn that as a human being. And so, we do see this wave that has been associated with better public health, and particular better maternal health. And what we see is that when you look after women And when they believe that their children are going to survive, they don't have so many of them. And so there's a very simple public health intervention that we can make, which is improve female education and improve female healthcare. And it's very cheap to do.
Good. But I mean, this population question does keep coming back. You know, it isn't one typically that economists who are concerned about the climate or resources return to. And population is one figure. But of course, one of the other things that we need to be very aware of is that, you know, people in different, you know, parts of the world with different levels of wealth have tremendously different rates of consumption of resources. And therefore, the problem is typically actually about equalizing actually the availability of resources to the people that exist, particularly getting those who overconsume to consume less in order to be able to support perhaps 9 billion. 9 billion is likely to be very close to the peak global population. And I think even within my lifetime, actually global population is going to start falling. That's what the projections now begin to say.
But we can't have 9 billion people all behaving like rich Americans. Or me, actually.
Yes. Okay. Any other points and questions? Yes, two questions here. And then we might be near to the end. The time is running out. But first a question here. We'll take them together. And then a question here. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Simon Fippard. I'm a law graduate from several years ago. I was thinking about your opening words about the process of transition, and I was thinking about the measures that governments introduce to help us. There's been quite a lot of talk about the bottom-up pressure from individuals and individual level behaviour.
Yeah.
And my question comes from working for the aviation sector.
Yeah.
And in particular, the use of so-called sustainable aviation fuel as a means, one of the major means that the industry believes will help a hard to abate industry improve its act. I'm thinking about the different approaches that are being taken. So, for instance, in the US, there's a strong tax incentive to invest in sustainable aviation production. In Europe and the UK, there's very much more of a sort of finger-wagging-y approach saying the supply chain must put an increasing proportion of fuel into the system that qualifies as sustainable aviation fuel.
Yes.
A lot of quite polarized views on the better one. I wonder whether the panel have got any views on, general terms, stick versus carrot.
Right.
As to where we need to be.
Okay, very, very interesting. What sort of flavor of policy? And then we'll have the second question here, and then we'll try and take them together, and that'll be the close, I think. Yes.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rutuja. I am from ESG management. So I have a question with Catherine. So one of the McKinsey research suggests that like in a supermarket, like sustainable labeling improves the sales. So I just wanted to know in this like greenwashing and every situation, how much this situation is correct and what are the other ways that can improve the sale of the sustainable products?
Wow. Okay.
Why don't you take that first, and then we'll deal with sustainable sustainable aviation fuels. Yeah.
When you test what happens in supermarkets, it's not always generalizable. So that's one of the really big problems, because people shop in different ways in different places. The range is different in different places. The price point, the price sensitivity is different in different places. So yes, I'm pretty confident that you can find an experiment where people will have responded positively to better labeling. And in general, better labeling is definitely a good thing, but it's not a silver bullet. So as well as better labeling, which absolutely is good, although, as I said, people don't always understand the trade-offs behind it, you also have to think about what the range selection is. You have to think about where it's placed in store. you have to think about what the promotion is, you have to think about what the price point is, you have to think about a whole load of things if you want to drive consumer behavior. And I mean, if you think about, for example, there's a lot of work on switching to meat alternatives, meat substitutes at the moment. And that's an interesting problem because you can see it as a health problem. Or you can see it as a cooking problem. Like, do we know how to make interesting food out of plants? Or you can see it as a distribution problem, or you can see it as an agriculture problem. You know, it's necessarily a quite complex multidisciplinary problem. And so the actual answer is going to be much more specific than just a label. It's going to be a combination of things that you need to put in place that actually influence people. And different people will be influenced in different ways by different things. So yeah, more complicated than it should be. Sorry.
Great. And then
that works on other products too, right? Not just supermarkets.
And then carrots and sticks, and particularly in relation to sustainable aviation fuel. So the problem with aviation fuel, of course, it's a global industry which isn't regulated. There's no real international regulation of safety, but there's very limited international regulation of the environmental footprint of the aviation sector. And the pressure, I think, has come from carriers themselves, and then partly from the airframe makers and the engine designers. What is the right way of doing this? I think clearly there are all sorts of subsidy regimes which will enable the production of the agricultural commodities that are at the base of these biofuels. You might want to vary tax on aviation fuels. Again, that's something that's very difficult to do, as it is with shipping fuels. Very, very difficult global sector to regulate. The other thing I think that governments are tending to do is to encourage Boeing and Airbus and other aircraft producers to think about radically alternative, fuels, hydrogen, particularly, and maybe battery power as well for certain kinds of flights. I think it's a really problematic. I mean, I think SAF is problematic anyway. I mean, there are other ways of using the land for agricultural commodities, and maybe that's what we should be doing. So I'm not sure I have any clear. It's a difficult to regulate sector. Incentives will work to some extent, but to a large extent, I suspect it'll be the airline builders and the air carriers. It won't be the traveler, I think, that brings pressure for this. That is pushing this along, but the process will be very slow. We were talking actually this afternoon at King's. We're having a big debate about whether we should get into carbon offsetting, in particular in relation to business-related aviation. So of course our students travel to come to London, our academics travel to go to fieldwork, to go to Ladakh, for instance, to do their research, to contribute to knowledge. But at the same time, we're always, we're actually affecting the climate in doing so. So these are impacts that we need to take seriously and deal with. So, perhaps in the short run, actually, some of this offsetting is the way in which we deal with these irreducible emissions, which are associated with aviation. George, maybe finally, is there anything you want to say about sticks and carrots policy approaches from your perspective?
Not my research area. The only thing that I've been doing is I'm doing a project on climate assemblies, which of course are one way to try to generate policy. And the problem with climate assemblies is you bring people together and they say, well, what can we do? There's 1.4 billion people in India, 1.3 billion people in China, and they're digging a lot of coal, and I live in a council estate. And so what we're trying to do is to find ways to make these conversations a bit more hopeful, a bit more kind of accepting. And again, that goes back to things that academics can't do. So we're working with artists there. I don't have an answer as to how it will work or whether even it will work, but you know, I'll come back in a year and I can tell you.
Yeah. Okay, so I mean, just to sum up before I hand back to Jessica, I hope that you know what has come across today is although this was a seminar about climate and sustainability, you haven't seen any graphs with temperature and so on. It's really all been about people, organizations, change, how we achieve objectives in society. And I think that is the way in which at King's we're seeking to address this problem as a great societal challenge, which will be addressed and solved, hopefully, through the activities of individuals, of consumers, of companies, of governments, working together on really complex questions where often there are paradoxes and difficulties, and overcoming those and, you know, being visionary and hopeful, but also deeply pragmatic about how we make these changes together. I mean, just to leave you with one thing, a little slogan that we have for the initiative that we have at King's Climate and Sustainability. The little slogan we have for our internal audience is "Make change together." It's this idea that actually it's only by, you know, committing to seeking through our own activities as individuals, as students, as teachers, and as an organization to making change, often incremental change, but over the long term, that actually we're going to solve many of these really quite knotty and difficult problems. So thank you all very much for listening. We hope that this has been interesting. It's worth coming out on a wet evening. And also to those online, I hope this has been interesting. And I'm sure there'll be more of these occasions in the future. Now I'm just going to hand over to Jessica to round off. Thank you very much.